Does creativity decline after 30? We're going to be exploring Rick's theory on music and intelligence. This is a clip from our podcast that we do every Sunday at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So make sure you subscribe, hit the bell for notifications so you get notified when we go live. Rick starts by noting that many legendary musicians peaked in their 20s. So he's referring to writing music, okay, and why they don't write this anymore. You stop writing at the age of 30. So he has a whole theory on this entire thing. So he says, Rick starts by noting that many legendary musicians peaked in their 20s. He cites examples like the Beatles, who were mostly in their mid to late 20s during their most influential years. John Lennon and Paul McCartney, for instance, were about 30 when the Beatles split in 1970. Rick argues that while some solo work was great, it wasn't on the same level as the band's collective output. Other iconic artists like Jimi Hendrix, David Bowie, and Kurt Cobain also released their defining work in their 20s. So he goes on and he keeps talking about all of these artists that wrote a significant amount of their work in their 20s, and then after that, it didn't happen. But I was like, some of the people he mentioned, I'm like, they were also dead by the time they hit 30.
Yeah, fair enough.
Like Jimi Hendrix and Kurt Cobain are probably bad examples to use in this case. And the funny thing too is he starts off the video saying how he's going to piss everyone off, and he doesn't really. He has some good points of why you would like maybe not write as good music after the fact, but I think a lot of it has to do with life. So why might creativity seem to decline after 30? Rick suggests it has to do with two types of intelligence: fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. This was the first time I've ever heard anything like this. Actually. Fluid intelligence, which involves abstract thinking and problem solving, peaks in early adulthood. This might explain why young musicians produce groundbreaking work. On the other hand, crystallized intelligence, or the accumulation of knowledge over time, tends to grow with age. This is why artists like Johnny Cash, Bach, and Beethoven made impactful work later in the life by drawing on their experiences. Now, I have a different theory about this, and actually I learned this from my mentor, Josh, when I was doing the guitar acceleration thing. There's these pathways in your brain that are very malleable when you're young. And you're just forming. So when you learn at a very young age, it's really good to learn young because those are going to be harder and harder to break as you get older. And you have certain types of the day where you can learn better than others too as you get older. So when you get older, a lot of those pathways become very strong and you can't break them. So you have to figure out tricks and ways and stuff when you get older to do that when you're learning new things. Hence why we take so long to learn stuff when we get older. So there's that factor also. I wish to remember the science behind it. All right, so what I was referring to at this moment in the podcast was myelin genesis. Think of myelin genesis like putting insulation on the wires of an electric guitar, for say, all right? When you play an electric guitar, the sound is carried through cables from strings to the amplifier, right? If those cables are well insulated, the sound travels quickly and clearly from the guitar to the amp. But if the insulation is missing or damaged, the signal becomes weak, distorted, or delayed. So this is like the simplest way to put this, right? So in your body, myelin is like that insulation around nerve fibers. Just as the guitar signal travels better with good insulation, messages travel faster, more accurately in your brain and body when nerves have a healthy myelin sheath. So this myelin that just wraps around these cables is what helps insulate those things or those practices that you're learning, okay? So this is why activities that require precise timing, like playing an instrument, are easier when your nervous system is properly myelinated. The more you have, the better, right? So if myelin is damaged, it's like having a frayed guitar cable. The signals get slower, weaker, or jumbled, making it harder to move accurately or think clearly. Myelination, however, though, starts in the womb, but continues through childhood and adolescence. This is when it's the most active. Activities that require coordination, learning, and repetition, like playing guitar or learning a language, stimulate myelination in specific brain regions, making these skills easier over time. This is why it's so important to learn things, because it helps you. It helps your brain age better. You live longer. So people that learn a lot of different instruments as they get older, or people that play music, tend to live a bit longer, or somebody that's doing art or knows multiple languages, that has practiced that, they normally have a longer life expectancy. Normally. Of course, there's caveats to that, like anything. So myelin is created through a combination of cell growth, wrapping, and maintenance. The process is especially active in childhood, but it can continue throughout life in areas of the brain involved with learning new skills. as I refer to in this podcast later on. You can still create more myelin when you get older. It's just way more difficult. All right, back to podcast. That's why when you're young, it's really good to learn as many things as you can when you're young, because as you get older, it like solidifies and stays there. When you get older, it takes a lot longer to learn something or break those habits. So when I read about fluid intelligence and his crystallized intelligence, that's exactly what I thought about. It's like just another way to describe that. Read that comment real quick. So there's a comment that like summarizes what Eric and I were thinking when we watched this video.
Take this with a grain of salt. This is a random commenter on YouTube.
Yeah.
But he goes, I'm a psychologist. There are two general creative periods, before 30 and after 60. At these times, there are fewer demands and better conditions for promoting creative focus and development. The dip is generally because of demands for career, financial, and family stability. It's not really about intelligence. It's more about personal agency, motivation, and values. Acquired knowledge leads to the experienced mindset. P.S. The prefrontal cortex is found to be less active in jazz improv to reduce executive control and permit the flow and default mode network. In summary, in sum, creativity will flourish at any age, and if the opportunity, support, resources, and motivation are there. Be careful of cherry-picking psychology.
It's far more complex than most people realize. A good effort nonetheless. That's a pretty nice comment though, overall. They're talking specifically about creativity, and when I was listening to Beato talk about the crystallized intelligence and not crystallized intelligence, in my head, I was thinking of when you go to learn something, not so much creativity, but creativity does need to be practiced. You need to work at it. I do feel myself losing my creativity since I actually started this channel. I put off a lot of my writing, so I've been getting back to that, and it's hard, but luckily it's been more flowing. We wrote that one song really quickly, Toxic Walrus. That was very fast when we wrote that, but that was I had to get back into it, and all of a sudden we're like, okay, now we can write full songs again, and it became much quicker or whatnot. But interestingly, though, Rick points out that jazz music may bridge the gap in this whole thing. He says jazz musicians like Miles Davis and John Coltrane produce iconic works in their 30s, possibly because jazz combines both improvisational skill, fluid intelligence, and musical knowledge, crystallized intelligence. Rick's advice to younger creators: this is the time to do it before you turn 30. Until what you are great at and keep working. So I don't know. I think that just limits it, people, because for me, I was told you can never learn how to sing all my life. So that's why I stopped trying to learn how to sing. And at 30, I started learning. Now, granted, I did have musical knowledge before learning how to sing. So I learned piano and singing at the same time at 30. And I was awful. It was super awful. I'm not saying I'm any better now, but much better than I was when I first started. And so I do think it's possible to learn and be creative at any age. I do think it takes more work later on, just like that comment was saying. When life's happening to you at 30, because you have a lot more responsibilities, it is going to make it harder to be more creative, for sure.
Indeed.
Yeah. I'd love to see what you guys think about this. Do you think it declines with age with creativity, or does it just change? Let us know in the comments, and let us know how you feel about all that. I mean, personally, for me, I think it just depends on the circumstance of your life and what the fuck you're going through at the time. He brings up these other people like Bach and everything who learned, like they wrote songs at 70s. Obviously, if you're practicing writing music all the time, it is possible. That's my one thing with music theory. I learned music theory, and it sucks that I learned music theory at certain points, because sometimes I have to remember I can play other notes that are not in the scale. And since I practiced so many times doing the scales over and over again, I'm like, fuck, you can break out of it, Alan. You don't have to stay there, because you don't. That's how like some of the cool songs are made. It's because they'll do some weird, interesting things in the scales when they're writing music. Like with some of our favorite Japanese bands, they do that all the time. They'll stay in a certain key for most of the song, but then they just do these weird, quirky things I love. For example, Dicodec's Orthodoxy. I don't know if I would have come up that with later on, because the way the intro starts is very weird. It's like a chromatic chord progression that started off. And I was like, man, how did I even write that? And it took us like seconds to write anyways. It's not the hardest song or anything. It's pretty easy, but it changes from like a minor verse to major chorus. And then you have this weird chromatic section. Then it goes to a blues section / jazzy section. I'm like, man, That's cool. That it took no thought though, but that's when I was like barely like into music theory at all.
Yeah.
Until I met a guitarist from a band I was in called Artifact, and that's when he started having me practice like jazz chords, seventh chords, and going through all that. I started following the rules. I'm like, fuck, I need to break that. So it's very interesting how that works. But at the same time, I can write you a song in a minute. That's the benefits of music theory. It's just like you have to balance those two lines together.